This was long overdue. So first of all, thank you, Jordan, for making time. I mean, it's not always I have that opportunity of actually revisiting certain conversations. And I guess with the dynamism that our industry always move, I think that it is worth it. I mean, we are having this conversation 15 days away from the North American World Cup, which, as always, is big news, and we'll get into it. But first of all, I wanted to thank you and potentially start framing the conversation to where you've been up to 5 years later.
Yeah, no, thanks for reaching back out. Happy to kind of reconnect on a lot of these topics that we've talked about over the years. Yeah, I mean, obviously back then, I was at the club in Denmark that we owned at that time. I was chairman and CEO of a club in Denmark. Then we sold that club. I've done a lot of consulting work in the last couple of years with a lot of the different American investment groups that are looking at European football. And then more recently, I was part of a group and we bought a club in Scotland. And so I'm chairman and operating partner of a small club in Scotland called Kelty Hearts. So still very much dialed into the European soccer space, certainly from an American perspective, operationally, on the day-to-day, but also kind of on the macro business investment side as well.
All right, good to know. And that's a great kickoff in terms of, the topics that we wanted to discuss, because back then, uh, I could say, or we all could say that was the infancy of multi-club ownership models, and evidently people have come with different angles, basically informed from an existing property or the markets that they knew and trying to expand across the globe. Let's start there. I mean, what is the difference now back, 5 years after, in terms of how these things are being approached in the pursuit of success, right? In terms of
Yeah.
investing in different markets.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's slowed down certainly over the years as people realized how difficult the kind of multi-club models are to execute. I think now we're probably seeing a little bit more creative, investment strategies, whether that's MCOs that are focused on women's football or multi-asset portfolios, which is we own a football club, maybe we own a men's team, we own a women's team in a different country, we own an academy, maybe we own a sports tech company. You know, kind of figuring out ways to leverage the different diversified assets versus just saying, I'm going to buy three, four, five football clubs because I think over the years, people have realized how incredibly difficult that is. The football business is very difficult. It's difficult to successfully run one football club well and make it profitable. Then you layer on two, three, four, five clubs, and that becomes exponentially more challenging. Different countries, different rules and regulations and laws and whatnot. So I think we've seen several multi-club projects fail. That isn't necessarily just because the models didn't work, but because the financial backing behind it either wasn't legitimate or it wasn't strong enough to maintain the time horizon for a successful MCO. There are definitely still some out there that are trying, and some are successful and some aren't. And so I think it's been a very mixed bag, and I think people are kind of slowing down and saying, wait a minute, before I buy additional clubs, maybe I should look at what's worked in the market and what hasn't worked. And maybe that isn't necessarily just buying more clubs to support my men's football club. Maybe that's getting a little bit more creative, a little more diversified. Seeing more of that, I guess what I would say a little bit more sophisticated rather than just layering on more of the same kind of quote unquote business.
Yeah, and to be honest, there's also, I would say, an intangible aspect of it, because as these CEOs kind of multiplied in the industry and globally, uh, you we saw a lot of pushback from different fan bases, because something's got to give, right? So
Yeah.
usually the ecosystem works for the benefit of the anchor, which usually is in a more developed market that has better prospects in terms of commercial development to generate that return for investment. And
Yeah.
that means that, small clubs are developers in other markets that are being drained out of talent. And that's always a hard sell to local fans.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you're seeing a lot more regulation from whether it's UEFA, from FIFA. You're seeing a lot of kind of discussions around conflict of interest between clubs owned by the same groups and ownership groups. You're seeing a lot of, as you mentioned, pushback from fan bases, supporter groups who don't really like the idea of being perceived as a quote unquote feeder club. So yeah, I mean, I think it's challenging. You look at, for instance, Strasbourg and Chelsea's relationship, and like on a piece of paper, that makes a lot of sense, right? you have a top club and a top development league. You're both bringing players in that you sign and leveraging that academy, that strong youth development infrastructure that they have. But it's challenging. It's challenging to get those players an environment where they can actually transition. It's challenging to run the club, both clubs, but certainly run Strasbourg when there's so much resistance to it. So I think there's a lot of kind of negative externalities that folks don't think about before they jump into it because it's sexy, right? It's fun and sexy. I own a team in France. I own a team in Brazil. I own a team in Australia. At the end of the day, you're owning businesses and in many cases loss-making businesses, in many cases businesses that are very forward-facing and your quote unquote supporters and fans and employees aren't happy with what you're doing. So I think that those realities a bit have caught up to the folks looking at the MCO and working in the MCO space.
And in that, let's say, chapter of this conversation, I have two questions. One is what kind of held true to how MCOs or investment in sports was seen 5 years ago, and what broke in terms of the perception that we had and that didn't add up by evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the reason people are looking at MCOs, it's like the idea is that you control the pipeline to develop and sell players, right? I mean, instead of if I'm Chelsea Football Club, for example, instead of paying 50 million pounds for a player from Brazil, why not just own the club in Brazil? And not only do I get a quote unquote discount or a significantly reduced fee in terms of how I'm paying for that player, but I get to develop that player under my system and my philosophy. And so I think in some ways, some clubs have done that in terms of moving players, but it's also in some ways been extremely difficult. Assumptions that you can move a player from point A to point B to point C and it just goes kind of seamlessly have proven false in many cases. It becomes very difficult, whether that's because the players aren't good enough, the development pipelines aren't good enough, the players don't necessarily want to move. There's other negative things or difficulties in terms of moving those players. So I think that's something that it's been difficult. I think it's we haven't seen a lot of commercial synergies, maybe outside of Red Bull and City Football Group. I'm not seeing the existing MCOs having a lot of commercial synergies between their clubs. It feels like a lot of the MCOs that are still out there are very much siloed in terms of at least from the outside looking in. They're in different places and some are having success and some aren't. But I don't necessarily see a cohesive structure in place where the clubs are talking to each other and leveraging economies of scale, developing players and making this a real profitable business in a way that I think people foresaw 4, 5, 6 years ago. That's just the way I look at it. Obviously, again, I think in some ways people are doing things for different reasons. I think Bill Foley's group, who own Bournemouth, and they have a lot of investments in a club in France, a club in Australia. Again, I'm not necessarily sure their structures is designed to talk to each other. And I do think a lot of his clubs individually are having success. But whether the MCO model itself is working in a way people foresaw, I have a hard time with that one.
Yeah, I agree with that because you have those owners that run successfully, and there's a great dose of localization and understanding how they need to run the individual club in the market, but they don't try to make it all part of a working system because that's when you break the your local balance, right? And that takes me to something that you alluded at the beginning, which is that also diversification is taking many phases now, not necessarily geographical on a single sport or a single sport in a single category like men's sport, but actually diversifying into women's sports or even other sports. Because I mean, my background is basketball, and basketball now has been the talk of the town here in Europe. And you see a lot of football, let's say, entrepreneurs or clubs looking into this new era of basketball as well, which granted in Europe there's a culture of multi-sport clubs, so that's something that is not foreign to that. But probably that's a more reasonable way to approach that is actually enlarging what the brand and the sentiment is at the local level in different areas, expanding that all around rather than actually extracting to other markets in which that logic wouldn't apply.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think we've seen that in the UK a little bit, where you've seen, rugby league and some of these other sports that are owned by the same owners of, foreign investors who own football clubs as well. So yeah, and I think if you can build an ecosystem, certainly when you're thinking about investing in multi-sport properties in a specific market in Europe or globally in that sense, you're looking at infrastructure. I think you see what Birmingham City and that group has done. They're investing massive amounts in stadium infrastructure, and I think they're one of the groups that also invest in a rugby club as well, in addition to Birmingham City, which is obviously a pretty big club. So yeah, I think there's creative ways to figure out how to leverage your investment and the asset you have, which in many cases is just a football club, into a bigger, larger investment thesis. And oftentimes that is infrastructure, that's stadiums, that's getting creative in other sports. And those teams maybe by themselves aren't massively quote unquote profitable, but the infrastructure business is can be quite profitable. So that's kind of a creative way for sure that people are looking at it.
Yeah, and the testament to that is that this new era of basketball in Europe is being anchored on the infrastructure piece, right?
Mhm.
Having an indoor venue that you can operate for entertainment basically across the year beyond the 40, 50 basketball dates. It's how, the whole proposition and thesis is being laid out. In and adjacent to that, one of the other things that precisely wasn't that open in the industry, but has always been there is in terms of how that capital structure for investing in clubs has been laid out. Now there seems to be a worry in terms of that the source of capital is mostly private credit, and we know there has been very noticeable examples on how credit could be somewhat dangerous to football or sports ownership. What's your take in terms of how that capital structure or capital stack it's being developed now and deployed, and what could be the potential risks that this has in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's concerning. Obviously, we've seen more institutional investors come in. That doesn't mean it's exclusively, but more private equity firms. And they're layering more and more debt on these clubs. I mean, I think a lot of clubs, take Premier League clubs, for instance, have layered on debt, leveraged on future parachute payments and future player sales. And they've been doing that for years, which is not necessarily a healthy way to run a business. But I do think that debt has become alarming, and the more institutional players are trying to get creative in terms of how they fund the ongoing commitments of these football clubs, which obviously require a significant amount of capital and are, for the most part, loss making. So it's a problem. I think it's a challenge. I think you look at, again, if you take Chelsea Football Club, not to keep going back to them as an example, but it's a big club. You know, They've run through significant amounts of capital. There's large amounts of debt. I think their investment group is likely looking at it as we bought the club at 2.5 billion pounds, and now, it's certainly we believe is worth 6 or 7. Whether that's true or not, that's probably what they're thinking. And whether we layer on a lot of debt or whether we layer on a significant amount of operational losses, we're still going to be way ahead when we go to exit. So there's still a lot of this thinking around we'll be fine once we exit. And just the question, which I have a little bit concerns about it, is there a long line or a long list of folks that are willing to come in to dig out of the holes that these clubs are getting in from a financial perspective? And so I don't have an answer for you. I would like to see more financial regulation. Of course, as an American, in global football, we need, it would be great to see a salary cap and wage constraints
Mhm.
and more financial regulation, because I think the current financial regulation's not serious, to be honest with you. Whether that's PSR, whether that's, financial fair play, I think it's not a serious deterrent in terms of stopping clubs from overspending. But I think as long as it's kind of this free for all right now, for the most part, in terms of spending money and accumulating debt, it's going to create challenges. And whether we see clubs fail now or in the future or whatnot, I don't know. Probably not. But it's not a healthy, there's no world. Anyone that says the football business ecosystem is healthy, I just don't believe that. It's just not a healthy ecosystem. And to your point, debt and more institutional investors haven't necessarily improved that larger macroeconomic sense from my perspective. I think the hope was institutional investors are going to come in and run better businesses, just
Yeah.
run clubs more efficiently, make it a more sound business because that's their MO. I haven't really seen that happen from the way I see it.
No, and that's something that is a little bit disappointing because back then we discussed about the lack of professionalization because most of those clubs were, uh, almost volunteer endeavors, right? At the local level, private equity, more sophistication will, help them to untap other ways of commercialization. But basically, it has been just accelerating or ballooning future revenue based debt, which has been the norm for over 20 years in I will say in general sports, but football particularly. Now also, I keep going back to basketball, which is almost my day to day. which there's not a transfer market yet as in football. So actually that takes away one of the legs. Media, it's growing, but not at the level of football. And that's pretty much the deterrent of it. But when you look at how these pressures for more investment now to theoretically grow the product, that's how the CBC investments and came
Yeah.
across the different football leagues, and there's not much more to show for after that investment round, but you have the debt and you need to actually repay that 40, 50 years from now. So it's a huge mortgage on the business, and it's worrying. It's really worrying
Yeah.
because I would say that the closest the European system, at least at the big league level, has that is a backstop to a disaster compared to the US, in which you don't have relegation there, we have relegation here, but those clubs mean so much socially that you almost are playing with the king's powder because you know that certain clubs are not going to be allowed to fail,
Correct.
and
Yes.
that is unfair ultimately to the fans, but even to the taxpayers that know that now or later they will pick up the tab of a football club that probably it's not even your football club, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think I think a lot of these decisions are made at football clubs with the assumption is like, if we overspend, if we do have to leave one day, well, someone will figure it out. You're right. The club, these large clubs will never go bust, but it hurts the supporters. The smaller clubs that do go bust, that's problematic. So it would be nice, I think, probably not realistic, but it would be nice to see some sort of more stringent regulations over the way these clubs are run for the most part. And I think that would help the whole ecosystem, but I'm not optimistic that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, definitely. No, moving now more for the global lens and 15 days away from the start of the World Cup, which is momentous in general. I want your opinion later on what what is the perception of this transformational World Cup as it was pitched to the world in the US, and what could potentially be the real challenges into the business of the World Cup, and what is going to be the aftermath for North American football as well. But going into the global lens of football, I and without getting into the financials, it's just that we're talking about different products. I mean, the discussions that we are having now in terms of the calendar in the year of MLS, are they going to switch or not? Uh, NWSL plan to switch to the European calendar, let's put it that way, but seems that they backtracked that because they weren't ready yet. What's your take on that? Because back then, and in another of those conversations that I had 5 years ago with Charlie Stivitano, which is an insider of the industry, one of the things that we were betting on is that the World Cup, as an aftermath in North America, will somehow push for some sort of homogenization and integration of the North American ecosystem, meaning mostly Mexico and the US, and to some extent Canada, to try to create something that is similar to the European landscape, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem, or at least it's not evident now, that's going to be a short-term result of this.
No, I don't think so. Yeah. I mean, look, soccer in North America has grown immensely in the last 5 years, for sure. Bigger clubs, higher valuations, more interest, better infrastructure, because the infrastructure, I think, is one of the strong points of soccer in this part of the world. Same goes for Liga MX in Mexico. There's been foreign investment now. But is the World Cup per se as an event a kind of tipping point moment for soccer in this part of the world? Is it going to have any sort of strong institutional change to the way the sport is looked at or the business side of the sport? No, I don't think so. Not at all, actually. I think the World Cup is another one of these global events that people will get excited because they're not excited yet, and we'll get into that why in a second. But people get excited and there's interest in the sport and more kids will play the game, and maybe that means more people will watch the game a little bit, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to watch MLS or Liga MX for that matter. I think, frankly, what I've noticed recently is more folks latching on to the storytelling of global football, like a Wrexham, for instance, rather than anything local in North American soccer. And that doesn't mean the sport hasn't grown. The sport has grown. And I tell this to people, is like when we talk about the growth of soccer in the last couple of years in the US and in North America, it's grown, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the domestic league. And some of that's due to the fact that games are on Apple TV and it's hard to find those games and
Mhm.
there's so much oversaturation with other sports. But the bottom line is like the Premier League has grown, some of the other European leagues have grown, the Mexican league is still extremely popular. But I think MLS, and then obviously there's competition now with the women's league as well, the NWSL. Like MLS lags, and to your point about the calendar change, like that might help the business model around selling players and whatnot, but that's not going to make any difference in terms of the market, in terms of people caring about teams. Messi coming was a big deal, but like, is that again a tipping point for the sport? No, I don't think so. So it's a very complicated and very saturated both in other sports and in it,
Yeah.
this sport specifically. It's such a crowded market space, and MLS has crafted specific niches in that in certain markets. Many markets they're not particularly relevant. They've had a difficult time growing the TV revenue. And so by this time, you would have thought maybe there would be more growth. Obviously, if you look at the business, the valuations are enormous. Clubs are trading at 500 or 600 million. Is there the underlying business metrics to justify that? No, not really. It's more being driven by scarcity. Um,
Mhm.
but this kind of idea, and I've heard it over the last couple of years of like the World Cup's going to change everything. It's going to be this game changer for the sport. I don't believe that, and that's certainly I don't think really showing itself as we approach the World Cup starting in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and to that point, it's a structural difference. And soccer has always been popular in the youth in the US. Thing is that, at some point, if you are an athlete, you just choose other sports to continue to your college career and pros and whatever. So that puts you in a disadvantage into actually capturing the attention because of that storytelling value of having a local hero that people rally around, and actually it's an inspiring factor. And people just, with the growth of popularity and importing stars, just look to, a better version of the game. So it's the English Premier League or the Spanish League, and just adopt those teams as fandom. In the case of the calendar, and I could see how any league that in the US, especially the top men's and women's league that were approaching a potential change in the calendar, it's not necessarily they had two fronts there, right? It's if you go to the European calendar, you're not only facing the bigger European leagues in terms of media attention, which they already capture and conquered your market. So it's subjecting yourself to some sort of pain there, but also you are competing with the other local domestic league that are really popular. So it's NFL football, NBA. You know, I think that for soccer, just competing with baseball in the summer kind of is probably the easier pill to swallow. So that's a big
Yeah.
challenge, right? Yeah.
No,
So
look, I think the calendar does create opportunity, right, in terms of less competition. It also creates issues where you're having more games in a certain time of year, weather becomes a factor. And so, like, look, I don't necessarily think the change of calendar is a net negative for the league at all. I just don't necessarily see it as a game changer per se and the interest in the league. And that, I think in my mind, if someone was asking me, I'd say a new television deal where there was more accessibility to the product. I think that's a big problem. I think, you have a lot of legacy ownership that don't market their clubs properly. Many of the Major League Soccer clubs are not relevant in their markets. Um, and obviously it hurts the league that our national team in the US hasn't done really well, and there's not a lot of buzz on our national team, so that hurts. So those are challenges. On the flip side, again, they've invested extremely well in infrastructure. The stadiums are great, the match day experience is great. Like they've crafted a nice niche for themselves. The question is, how do they take the next step? That's the challenge. And they've been talking about that MLS, whatever, 3.0, 4.0 for many years now. I don't know. It's obviously I'm not sure what they're thinking.
yeah, and as valuations go, everything probably with the right assumptions goes to a round number. But if you don't translate that into price, which is someone willing to pay that price, then you just have a nice PowerPoint in it.
You would think we're getting to a point of oversaturation when it comes to the valuation of MLS clubs. I don't think there's a long line of people with like really legitimately willing to pay 500 to a billion USD on a Major League Soccer club that's doing 30, 40,000, 30, 40 million in revenue, that's losing money because most of the clubs are still loss making. I could be wrong. There's talk of Vancouver moving to Las Vegas at those valuations. So maybe there's a couple markets left that can justify that. That doesn't even factor in the cost of building a stadium. But I think in the long run, it seems difficult to justify those valuations. But definitely, I could be wrong there.
Yeah. No, it's just a wait and see and a bet of
Hmm.
some sort. Actually, segueing to women's game because it's true that the men's national team hasn't been stellar in international play, which kind of dims a little bit the potential. But on the flip side, the U.S. women's team has been the dominant force for the last 20 years, right? Only now there's more competition, the Spanish team and some other Europeans, but intrinsically it's a better competition system, the one that the women's national team, and on the back of that, NWSL was founded or refounded because it's a later iteration of many other attempts before. And then you see also, a different path, also growing valuations, also growing in terms of kind of sexy markets that can actually play into that. But it doesn't seem that ludicrous like with the men's game. At least they have something to show for it, right? In terms of the
Yeah.
quality of play and so on. But still, it's within the bubble of women's sports, which it's limiting.
Yeah, I mean, I think women's sport and women's soccer is such an immature market in terms of like it hasn't exploded and hasn't been around for 150 years like the men's game has. And so I think the NWSL, what they have going for them is it is the best league in the world. You do have a couple clubs in Europe that are very good, but it's a product that we as Americans can look towards and say, oh yeah, this is the best league in the world with the best players for the most part. So I think that's something it has going for them, and it's so early, it's in such a growth phase that I think it has a leg up versus the men's game in North America, which has been around for a while and is at times over the years gotten a bit stagnant and does have to compete with the better leagues. So that is a pretty big differentiating factor. Obviously, same deal with the women's side goes to the men's side, which is you're seeing valuations that are far outpacing what the core business is. But there is an assumption of continued growth. The demographics of women's sports are completely different from men's sports. So that's a demographic area where there is a lot of opportunity. So, yeah, I have some of the same concerns on the women's side than I do on the men's side in North America, but I do think there is more upside and more opportunity, and I can understand why people are looking to that specific quote unquote asset class as kind of a real growth area. I can understand that.
Yeah. Right. So, but shifting back to the men's game and the World Cup in a couple of weeks from now, um, the last 2 3 months, I would say that in terms of PR or perspective, has been very challenging for FIFA to convey an up to the right narrative around it.
Yeah.
Pricing of the tickets, it's crazy. Then there's the whole transportation around the cities, and actually from my perspective, it shows the lack of understanding on how the U.S. economic and political framework works, and no matter if you're the World Cup or the Olympics for that matter, it's not that there's a lot of a lot of public money to actually to subsidize a private endeavor, right? Especially in this political climate, which people needs has their elected officials to a little higher standard, right? But the reality is that what you see now, 2 weeks from now, is that if they continue to make the stance of in terms of maintaining those prices, which feel a little bit artificially, propped up, uh, and if you add to that the reality of what that tournament means across 3 countries, and especially a country like the US, which is so vast that for you as a fan to be able to plan like you did in World Cups before, in which you could see the group stages, stage games of your national team, it's almost impossible in the way the competition structure is being designed. I definitely see that we could see what no one wants to see, which is, empty games, challenges for people to go and actually, kind of providing a lackluster
Yeah.
proposition, right? And that will be detrimental for any type of growth or perception that this could be an inflection point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a mess. I don't think there's any way around it. The ticket pricing issue is a big problem. We could probably spend a whole hour talking just about that. There's very little buzz right now. We're 2, 3 weeks away. I'm sitting here in California. Not a lot of people talking about it. Not a lot of people getting excited. I think FIFA has a challenge. Now, do I think once the games start that we'll see empty stadiums? Probably not. I think FIFA knows how to run these events. They'll figure out ways to get butts in the seats and get people at the games. I do think for some of the less attractive games, the prices will definitely come down, certainly on the secondary market. So I think it will probably be a fine event. It will be a challenging event as a supporter. And, the bottom line is the United States right now isn't the most welcoming country in the world in terms of bringing visitors in either. So there's a lot of factors pointing to this event being difficult, right? Um, and so I mean, we'll see once the game started. Sure, when Brazil is playing Scotland in Miami, the stadium will be full and the atmosphere will be great, and there'll be plenty of folks from Brazil and plenty of folks from Scotland at the game. And same goes for some of the big clubs. I think one area people aren't talking about a lot is the expanded format has created a lot of really unattractive games. Like I live
Yeah.
here in Northern California, and some of the game we have Paraguay, Qatar, Sweden versus Jordan. It's awful games that no one cares about. And like, cool, it's great the World Cup's here, but the amount of people that I know that are trying to figure out how to sell their tickets or get out, it hurts the buzz, right? Like, yeah, there are big games, but like there isn't a lot of buzz. And so is that going to hurt this whole idea of, this being an inflection point for the sport in the country? Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I liken it a lot to the Club World Cup that was here last summer.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're not the same scale, but it was a mess. Organizationally, it was difficult. There was no buzz, and then the event started, and people got pretty excited, and some of the games were great, and it was fine. But like, did it change? The event ended, and people moved on with their lives. Like, I don't think this World Cup's going to change anything in terms of the sport in this country. Again, a kid might go to a game and in 15 years decide they want to be a professional soccer player, and that's part of the long-term macro growth of the sport. But like, will we see any tangible KPIs of growth of the sport in this country because of this World Cup? Even if it was well run and well organized by FIFA, I don't think so.
Yeah. No, it feels like that. I mean, in the end, the big ticket national teams, especially at the right location, right? Like you said, Brazil, Miami, and that, or Argentina for that matter. That could be something that drives, but definitely probably it's too big of a change. This format of competition and an expanded field in a market that it's expensive is probably going to be a double challenge. I mean, but at some point you need to start it. So probably, it's something that they are thinking of writing down anyhow and then just going from there. So, let's see. And to be honest, what we want to see is pure competition and probably a good Cinderella story, like in the last World Cup, that actually gets you excited, and you can frame that in the backdrop of a big city like LA or New York or whatever, and actually that elevates the value of the narrative, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I think to your point though as well, it's like there's been a lot of barriers put up in terms of people getting excited and saying, yeah, I want to go see that event, whether that is the ticket price, which is a big barrier right now, whether it's the parking, whether it's the accessibility, whether it's the visas if you want to come in as a foreign fan. Like barriers are being thrown up that are making this event much more difficult for people to get excited about.
Yeah, definitely. And to be honest, 2 years away from the Olympics in LA, it actually puts things in perspective for that organizing committee in terms of how they need to approach. At least everything is condensed in one city, but still, if you don't pay attention to what is being a problem now, you might end up having the same issues back then, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. So, to wrap up a little bit, I mean, one of the things that shifted dramatically in the industry in the last 5 years was not the eruption, because Middle Eastern capital was already part of the ecosystem. And if you go back to the early days of Qatar sports investment with BeIN and PSG and all that, that those were there already. But what we saw from last conversation to this one is actually the eruption and the acceleration of Sa- Saudi Arabia's investment into sport, which has been repositioned. Let's say there are some things like Live Golf, which didn't pan out after 5 billion investment, And then there's the whole geopolitical situation. And it kind of put in, or this is my reading, puts it in perspective because there was a severe dependency on Middle Eastern capital. And it's not just that. I mean, they are across NBA, they're across any many other sports. Would Now we need to factor these macro geopolitical occurrences as part of the risk. So we need to price that into the future. What could be the perspective around that? Because those are completely, I wouldn't use now untraceable events. Although if you look at polymarket or culture, probably you'll see what could happen. But you know what I mean? It's that dependency of certain pockets of capital into sports has distorted the whole market, but also created a level of dependency that is very difficult to unwind.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I mean, I think when there's an assumption that, for instance, in the Middle East, there's unlimited amounts of capital coming into sport or anything for that matter, that is not a sustainable way of running a business and understanding that whether that's league distributions from media rights, whether that's ownership, operational commitments. I mean, you saw Live Golf. I think Live Golf's an interesting one in terms of, they're making the case that now they can go out and get foreign investment now that PIF has stopped their commitment, and we can sell franchises. And I don't think anyone seriously believes that's a business that can stand on its own without massive amounts of funding from the outside world, and that there will be any interest in investment in that platform. I don't believe that to be the case, and so. Yeah, I mean it's difficult. The thing that I think of when you mention this topic is like an over-reliance right now in Western Europe of American investors buying
Mhm.
football clubs. Like if that faucet were to turn off, which I don't believe it's going to turn off anytime soon, but if it were to turn off, that would be problematic. Half the clubs in the top four divisions in England are all owned by Americans, and so I think that's a
The Italian
problem.
league as well, which
Italian league, the French league, we own the clubs in Scandinavia, so. I think it just comes all the way back to maybe the beginning of this conversation is that these businesses need to be sustainable as a standalone investment on a day-to-day basis, right? They, whether even if they're loss making, there needs to be pathways to profitability. And no one's saying, and again, I've said this before many times over the years, no one's saying you should wring every penny out of a football club or even frankly, you know, figure out ways to have dividends and stuff like it needs to be sustainable though, and every investor I've ever talked to talks about sustainability, but no one actually acts in a way that needs to that can run a club sustainably. And again, that goes to controlling for costs and figuring out wage constraints. And sure, we can talk about growing revenue all day, every day, but like, how do we keep our costs down? And this is why sports works in North America and why the valuations are crazy. It's because the whole ecosystem is built around how do we make these sports teams profitable businesses. And I'm not saying by any stretch we should do a one-to-one. This is the way things should be in Europe or globally. But they're so far drastically far apart when it comes to the business side that if that tap were to turn off from foreign investment, for instance, in many of these leagues, the whole ecosystem would fall apart. And so that's the problem. And again, I don't have answers. There's not a lot of willpower, I think, from a lot of folks to figure out at a macro level how to make the industry more sustainable, but it's just not happening right now. And it's frankly getting worse. And that's just unfortunately the way the industry is.
yeah, and to adding to that, I think that the main difference in the two models, other than the governance and the economic structure and cost control measures, which is something that everyone should aspire to running a business, is that the European game, regardless of sport, is being considered as more passion first and business second because of the social impact that it has, right? And I think that even savvy investors that are all across football and basketball, for that matter, in here in Europe, when they look at the reports and the numbers of their other investments that are not in sports, they certainly run them with a discipline that they are not applying into sports, which is actually
Yes.
the more awkward thing. But it's someone, a good friend that is an investor, so told me is that the high people get when they are in an owner's box winning a title or in a run for a playoff, or the fear that they get by, if they're disciplined, probably their team doesn't win or they don't sign the big star that is on the market, and the backlash in the community, it's it distorts any type of criteria. But something's got to give at some point. I mean, you cannot have it both ways.
Yeah, there's I think a tension between should football clubs or sport, in Europe, sports organizations be considered businesses. And I think at one time it was the local team, the local football club, and the local business owner was putting some money in, and maybe it was losing a little bit, but it was for fun. And now they become billion-pound businesses, right? And the scale and scope of the business side of the sport in Europe now, for instance, has become so large, it is a business. Whether, we can have a healthy debate. I can have a healthy debate with a supporter who says this shouldn't be a business, but when your revenue is 500 million pounds a year, you're a business, right? Like it needs to be treated like a business.
Whether you like it or
So
not.
whether you like it or not, exactly. So that is the tension, and I don't think anyone really wants to have a hard conversation around that. And it's hard. Obviously, I've invested myself. I now know a lot of very wealthy individuals who invest in sports organizations, and I don't know any of them that enjoy waking up every morning and losing money or having capital calls or just dumping money in. Like they're going to wake up one day and say, I don't want to do this anymore. This isn't fun. And like that's a problem, right? That's
Yeah.
a sustainability problem. And we have to find a way to solve for that. Like one of the reasons I'm at a small club in Scotland right now is because at that level, it's such a low level that you can figure out a way to craft more or less a sustainable model because the cost basis is so low. The problem is it's not sexy. We're not playing in the Champions League. It doesn't have this massive revenue upside. But can we figure out how we can translate that model to a Champions League? Premier League clubs shouldn't be losing money, right? They shouldn't. Like you're getting 100 million
It's
pounds
insane.
minimum in
Yeah.
TV money. You have a huge global audience. You're filling stadiums and 50, 60,000 seat fans. There's no world Premier League clubs or Champions League clubs should be losing money. Yet, what, 70, 80% of them more probably lose money year on year, lots of money. It shouldn't happen, right? But again, there isn't the willpower necessarily from the clubs, from the governance, from the larger governance macro perspective to change that philosophy. And as long as there's a continues to be a list of folks that want to come in and give this a shot and have enough capital to do it for as long as they want to do it, it'll be fine. But if we're sitting here in 25 years and not 5 years, what's it going to look like? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, to wrap it up, Jordan, if you were starting today with the knowledge that you have accumulated and the exposure that you have to that, which are the three, five tops things that you will focus as an investor into sports?
Infrastructure. I think infrastructure at these sports organizations is so incredibly important. Either existing infrastructure or the ability to craft a business model around infrastructure, because that creates revenue streams that other football clubs don't have or sports organizations don't have. So I think that's number one. I'd probably be looking at more emerging markets when it comes to geographic locations. I think some markets, take Western Europe, take England, for instance, become so saturated that everyone is just wants to buy a team in that league or in that country. Valuations rise. To me, look for places where other people aren't looking. It's the same you would look at it in deal sourcing and outside of the sports world. So I think that's a pretty big piece of it. Then the last one, which has kind of been something I've thought about and brought to a lot of the projects I've worked on, is human capital is so incredibly important. I can buy a club and it can be a great deal with great upside in Spain, but if I don't have folks on the ground who know how to operate the club well, if I don't have a board and other investors and folks around me who can continue to build up and philosophically are aligned with the way I want to run things, like lots of people have lots of really good ideas in sports. Very few people have the know-how and wherewithal to actually execute on those models, and you need good people to do that. So that's a big piece of, I think, any successful model.
Absolutely. Jordan, thank you very much, always for your kindness and sharing knowledge, and it's always
Of
fun
course.
to speak with you. I will wish you a great summer of soccer. I just hope you go to somewhere else, not Northern California, to watch it.
Yeah, we're gonna be up in Canada for a little bit, so I'll probably go to some games up there. I'll go to games, but like for whatever reason they don't like Northern California because the games are not great here. But such is life. We'll figure it out. It'll be fun.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and speak soon.
Thanks.